Who were the Vikings? The Vikings came from what is now known as Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. However, they were not one race as such, rather small groups from all over the region. Also, Vikings weren't just limited to Scandinavia. Historical records indicate Finnish, Estonian, and Sami Vikings as well. Aside from occasional trade, they had very little to do with one another, and in fact often fought amongst themselves. That being said, the Viking were united as a group in one circumstance: the eyes of the conquered. They came from foreign lands, were seen as uncivilized, and were not Christians. That would come later, of course. Relatively few Norsemen actually set sail on raids and trade missions in the early years, at least until settlements were founded elsewhere. Instead, many worked out their lives as farmers or fishermen. Throughout Scandinavia, settlements were typically small farming communities home to just one or a handful of families. Power was far from centralized, relying instead on a local chieftain and the alliances he would make along the coastline. We can assume that society was organized in a kind of redistribution system. This would involve the chieftain collecting taxes from the people in exchange for protection, the development of infrastructure, and the organization of other common business. In this way, the chieftain developed his power, alliances, and wealth. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Europe was growing wealthier. Scandinavian furs were prized items, and it's believed this early trade taught the pre-Viking people about sailing technology and the politics and weak points of Europe. Some believe overpopulation caused the Vikings to begin their travels, but that seems unlikely because the early raids were for riches, not land. Norsemen always had an important relationship with the water for food and transport. The development of faster, more reliable ships seems to have played at least a part in triggering the expansion overseas. At Lindisfarne, Viking raided in 793. It was the very first that was documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, personal letters, and the famous Doomsday Stone, as they're the first written sources referencing a raid. It's typically taken to be the beginning of the era. It was the first of many attacks on monasteries along the British coastline. The Norsemen quickly identified these buildings as sources of wealth with weak defenses, making them very attractive targets. Buoyed by this early success at Lindisfarne, Viking raids became more numerous. Just 2 years later, they struck undefended island monasteries in the Hebrides and Northern Ireland. For more years on, and continental Europe was hit. The island monastery of St. Philiberts on Noirmoutier, near the estuary of the Loire River, was targeted in 799. Despite this, it was the British Isles that remained target number 1 for Viking raids for many years. It wasn't for another 40 years or so that attacks in continental Europe became commonplace. They achieved this in part by taking advantage of internal conflicts in Francia. After a period of prosperity for the Vikings in West Francia, King Charles the Bald began increasing his defenses. As towns, abbeys, and rivers were fortified from around 862, the Vikings, principally from Denmark, turned their attention back to the British Isles. 3 Icelandic sagas tell of an army that invaded England in 866, led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok. They wanted to take revenge against King Law of Northumbria, who is said to have captured and executed Ragnar, thanks in part to the recent TV series. Ragnar Lodbrok is one of the most famous Viking. However, many historians consider the stories and even his very existence dubious. Some think Ragnar is actually an amalgamation of several people. As raids became more numerous, Vikings started to create settlements. They gained control of many Scottish islands, including Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides, along with parts of the mainland. Ireland saw the founding of trading towns including Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. From these bases, the Norsemen launched attacks elsewhere in Ireland and across the Irish Sea to England. Like and subscribe to see more.